Okay, great. Yes, my name is Rob Seeley, and my company, independent consulting company, is E3 Merge. I have been working over the last 5 years for LNG Canada around greenhouse gas management and climate policy. Prior to that, I had my 26-year run with Shell Canada and was very involved also in energy development projects, but also in climate solutions for those projects over those years. And that took me across many different people's paths. And I was reflecting back on some of it as I was trying to pull together this presentation, and it was a comment from one of my colleagues just the other week. He asked me, "Oh, how's that project in East Kalimantan doing?" And I'm like, wow, that was like 15 years ago, and tromping through the jungle of Borneo and trying to measure carbon from peatland rainforests and having tea with headhunters in central Kalimantan. It's amazing you can go from energy development to something like that, right? But that's what the world of offsets will take you into. It takes you into far reaches of places of the world, particularly when you get into this idea of carbon sinks. Anyways, we're not here to talk about those adventures. This was essentially, I just did a little snapshot on what is the BC policy today for industry, and we have the BC government in the room, so please correct me or please just add in your comments, would be welcomed. And then I wanted to shift to a little bit about some of the work I did with Jeremy Hewitt, actually, from the BC government, and his team, and myself, and Richard, others, and the BC Business Council. Yeah. But Steve Carr is going to talk more to that tomorrow about the BC and the low carbon industrial strategy that you had referred to. He's going to go through that tomorrow, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about the piece we did within that, which was really around market mechanisms, offsets, trading. How could that be a lever for BC going forward on competitiveness and on around growth, really managing the emissions of economic growth? So I am going to touch on that and some of the learnings from that. As far as the policy goes, this is from the Clean BC plan, the chart on the right, and it's about that 30%, in fact now 40% reduction in emissions by 2030, and how we're going to get there. And they've got their very nice rainbow chart that shows the segments of their program. It's a great program. Those guys have a lot of work ongoing to deliver on the program. I think a couple things in there that it covers: buildings, transportation, industry. A couple of the things that I did want to touch on in the program are that the green bar on the bottom, it's the piece that is yet to be identified. So of that reduction, which is roughly 25 million tons, right, guys? So it's kind of what we're shooting for by 2030 from where we are today: buildings, transportation, industry, and then yet to come. So that's maybe an opportunity for this whole piece around markets, trading, offsets. Can that be a part of the BC, Clean BC yet to come? And of course, everybody at this table would be saying yes, and it must be. But essentially, there's an opportunity there for that discussion. I think the other big thing from the plan that I was concerned with, actually, a little bit, was about the idea of economic growth. So the little curve along the top, it's kind of almost like means the economy just stays doing what it's doing, but it doesn't really grow. And we see a bunch of big things on the horizon that could come for British Columbia, and LNG was one of them. And so then how does this program account for economic growth, particularly where it would bring some emissions into the profile? And so it felt like economic growth was not being addressed in the plan, but again, maybe an area for offsets, trading, and market mechanisms. But those were the two kind of things that I wanted to point out about this chart. We need to think, how are we going to manage the economic growth? Because I'm not sure it's covered in there. And then the green bar, how are we going to cover that, the rest that needs to happen
Just add that the government would say the plan is economic, climate, and energy rolled into one. So there is some economic thought in there for growth.
I like it.
Maybe not the kind you're looking for, but
Something, yeah, yes, okay, great. So that's it. I think people are familiar with the BC policy, that, you know, moving to $50 per ton, which is by 2021. The 30% is now 40%. Is 40% legislated?
yep.
It is now. Yeah, that came under the NDP government last year, or
Yeah, and we just passed amendments this past fall to
right.
strengthen our reporting.
So it's 40% legislated now and 80% legislated by 2050.
Baseline, what's the baseline here?
2007, right? 2007 baseline.
40%.
40%.
2007, 2030.
Yeah.
How are we doing right now on that, by the way?
Well, the chart kind of shows you a little bit leading into there. The one thing we have shown, and we talk a lot about this with international presentations, we led the country in growth over the last 6 to 8 years while keeping things relatively flat. The challenge now is the curve.
I think the number is 2%. So net reduction since '07 with a carbon tax, predominantly a carbon tax policy. Now there are other levers in there that are happening, but clearly we need, this is back to, we need more. If you're really gonna hit 40, that's the aspirations out there. I just say we're short on tools in the toolbox and we need more of them, especially if you're gonna hit 40.
So Katie asked a question that I don't think got answered correctly, actually. So from the 2007 baseline, correct me if this is wrong, it's a 30% reduction from that, correct? And it's a 40% reduction from current emissions because of the growth that happened since 2007. Is that the correct
No,
math?
we don't have anything based off today's emissions. It's off of the 2007 baseline. So it's, maybe it is 30. I should know that off the top of my head, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 40. That's right.
It's 40.
Yeah,
It's 40?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I'm wrong.
80 by 2050.
Yeah, probably, there hasn't been much change since '07. That's the other thing, right? So in DC
quick fact
emissions,
check.
roughly 65, 68 megatons. So, but I thought it was '07
It
baseline,
is.
40% reduction by
07 baseline, 40%.
by 2030. Now
By
that,
2030.
we only got 10 years left.
So we don't have to go into the story, but it did, like, back in the day, 2020 was the target year, right? And then it got pushed to 2030. Is that, yeah.
They took the 10 years and increased to 10%.
Right.
Yeah.
And the original baseline was 2005 or so levels, and there was no, anticipation, at least in the assumptions, for any kind of like economic, industrial expansion emissions from LNG coming online back in the day. I can answer that. No, there wasn't. Yeah.
So maybe, yeah, it's 2030 is when we have to be 40% reduction from '07, and that was in the plan shown to be about 25 million tons per year of reductions. Industry is responsible for the dark blue wedge. I'm trying to think, is that about 8 million tons? I'd have to go back in there and have a look. 8.7 or something like that. Anyways, so within the industrial part of it, the blue bar, there were a number of things in Clean BC. They talked about performance standards of the different sectors, and that we're going to set best in the world performance standards for our major industries. They talked about the carbon tax moving from 30 to 50, and then the fact that anything beyond 30 and up, they were going to hold that in a separate fund, and then if you were a top performer, you would get $20 of your $50 per ton carbon tax back as an incentive. So as an incentive to be a top, is a big ticket $20 a year around trying to move, I think the BC government that whole that piece along, which is what we'd call enabling infrastructure for carbon abatement. So
what about the other
piece
$30?
of the program
You're still accountable for that.
and low carbon
The
fuel
other
standard is
$30,
also in there. So there's other elements for industry
and the
that are in
one
there.
for
I don't
discussion
go through them all
goes to
in here,
general
but
revenue.
these were sort of the big chunks that I wanted to
that
cover.
general revenue was going there
And then
because
within
the
Clean
program
BC,
was carbon neutral, meaning the money would
bringing
be
it to
sucked
LNG,
through reducing
And Alex, because this is kind of what this table is about in the end. It is about LNG development in the Northwest and what can it bring in terms of economic value, what can it bring in terms of greenhouse gas reduction value for the world, but we've got our own footprint issue to deal with.
Over the years, that's kind of,
The Clean BC
think
did have
that's
this
changed a little. That's-
box
Couple
in
things,
here,
I
which
think.
basically
First of all, companies have been paying $30 a ton since 2012, so it's not a new number that they've been paying.
No.
And two, there still may be bits of that that have been baked in historical tax reductions from the revenue neutrality days. Extrapolating that would be difficult to show, I think, but original intent, it was carbon neutral from the get-go, personal income taxes, corporate taxes, so there still may be some lingering effects of that from historical.
Yeah, but in general, I would say it isn't being touted as carbon revenue neutral, excuse me, as much as it was in the original selling point of the program. So that $30 goes to general revenue. That $30 is not used for carbon abatement. Some of it could be, the government could comment on that, but in general, it is not. It is not, and that the component between 30 and 50 that's not returned to industry that's the piece that would be used for carbon abatement. That was the last point in it. So I think that's where we are. That's sort of the take on the Clean BC for Industry program. There's other things in there. The electrification is a big ticket around trying to move that whole piece along, which is what we call enabling infrastructure for carbon abatement. So an important piece of the program as well. And the low carbon fuel standard is also in there. So there's other elements for industry that are in there. I don't go through them all in here, but these are sort of the big chunks that I wanted to cover. And then within Clean BC, bringing it to LNG, and Alex, because this is kind of what this table is about in the end. It is about LNG development in the Northwest and what can it bring in terms of economic value, what can it bring in terms of greenhouse gas reduction value for the world, but we've got our own footprint issue to deal with. The Clean BC did have this box in here which basically says LNG development in BC, one of the conditions for additional LNG development in BC is that it fits within the province's climate commitments. And so when I go back to the other chart, I'm like, okay, well, I don't see it. The only way it can fit in is if it's net zero. Is one big way, but or some other policy tool. But tell me what they are, because it feels like there's a statement being made here without policy tools to show how that could be enabled to fit within. And that the LNG Canada trains 1 and 2 is identified as being within the plan and within the numbers and context. So anything beyond that needs to fit, but then it doesn't really say how. So that brings us to this whole piece. Really, this exercise is how do we make these additional LNG development fit within the plan? And I think your view is, well, we drive to net zero. That's the FNCI idea, and then if we don't, it doesn't happen. This is what you'll see maybe in Seeley's presentation tomorrow. But we've seen it in others. What we're seeing is that the BC LNG development is the lowest carbon LNG in the world, particularly as it relates to facilities. That's very clear. If you take the production pipe facilities, there's some jurisdictions you're closer to, but we're a big step change from U.S. Gulf Coast. We're probably like half the footprint of those guys. And that's where all the money's going. It's pouring in down there, and the facilities are, in the time we permitted and got one facility started, they built like 7 trains and they're running them. And they're building 2 more trains, and there's probably like 8 more projects looking for approval. So we have this disparity happening, and we need to be competitive. That's the other topic of conversation tomorrow in order to make some of this happen. But we still have the policy and the climate thing to try and square, to try and round. So So if we do nothing here, well, we help meet the BC targets. All the projects go somewhere else, and we have what's called carbon leakage, and of course economic leakage. All the jobs and investment go somewhere else. So we need
Rob,
other
what
tools.
about, what's Catter too? About 2 or 3 months ago, Catter was talking like huge increases. Is that still, like they were,
Qatar?
Qatar, yes, we
Qatar.
hear,
I know
yes,
Qatar.
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't
Yeah.
have the international outlook here. We will talk a little bit about it tomorrow. But certainly there's also East Africa has some projects. Even Nigeria again wants to bump up their production. So there is a lot of aspiration around the world to fill the gap that's being seen for LNG. LNG is a growing, it's a way to move gas around the world. And gas is a growing commodity, particularly in those jurisdictions that don't have it, and all they have is coal, and they're trying to reduce their own emissions, largely for air quality reasons. So, where am I in this presentation? Sorry, get back on track. So the BC had initiated a low carbon industrial strategy piece of work in partner with the BC government to look at this competitiveness issue of BC industry, sort of to prevent the carbon leakage and enable competitiveness and economic growth in British Columbia. And one of the pieces we did was around market offsets trading. The other levers, the major areas they looked at were electrification, infrastructure, regulatory framework. What else, Richard? There was 5 or 6 major themes, and market mechanism was just one. So I'm going to take you through just some of the high-level findings here. I'm not going to dive deep into the study paper that we did. Finding 1, let's see, phase 1, so then 6 industrial sectors were looked at, and we looked at pulp and paper, oil and gas, LNG was separate, aluminum, mining, I think it was more around copper mining, and lumber, yes. Those 6 sectors were reviewed. Basically, I think Fall was instrumental in a lot of that work, and 5 of the 6 sectors had the lowest greenhouse gas footprint of the competitors. I think the only outlier was pulp and paper, pulp and paper. And I think one of the finding there is our low carbon electricity. It's basically the BC grid at 93% or whatever, puts us in a very advantaged position when it comes to producing low carbon products for the world, particularly if we're exporting resources. And then the other piece, not unknown to us, carbon tax costs are among the highest. There's some others in Scandinavia that are very high as well, but we're among the highest in the world. And I made the point about if we can't compete, the investment will go elsewhere. Market mechanisms, offsets, yes. And so let's look at market mechanisms, offsets trading as a policy tool that could help address competitiveness and growth. So that's kind of what our work was geared around. And also recognizing that market mechanisms and offsets are proposed in the federal climate framework too, more importantly. So what does that mean to the BC climate policy as well? And then the chart on the right is actually LNG facility performance global. There's actually a very good update from Delphi on this. I don't know that this is maybe my version of the Delphi study, I can't remember. But what you'll see is these are the operating facilities in the world today, the blue bars in terms of LNG facilities and its carbon intensity, CO2 tons per ton of LNG produced. And the little red bar is essentially the BC performance standard for LNG facilities in British Columbia. And you can see how much lower we are than everything going on out in the world. And then I think, well, it might even be LNG Canada. So the BC target was 0.16 tons per
of CO2 per ton of LNG, and Canada was coming in at 0.14. So it does position our facilities. We have a number of natural advantages. Cold climate is one, but our low carbon grid is another. And then having a blank sheet of paper with a regulation that says thou shalt perform at this is another driver for sure. So anyways, and there's room to go further. Obviously, the more you electrify, the lower that little red bar gets. How can we be competitive and grow while meeting BC's climate goals? I think that's kind of for the FNCI kind of mandate here too. How can we do this? So I did talk about this briefly earlier, and that is that it's sort of the pathway, sort of three buckets: avoid emissions, and so you could imagine that our low carbon grid and building that infrastructure for renewable power, electricity is part of that avoiding. That's an avoiding bucket. Reducing is, okay, how do I burn less gas and go to a low carbon fuel standard and have a fuel that has less emissions when I combust? So that's another bucket of activities. And then at some point you run out of things to do and you're stuck with these emissions, and now what do we do with those? And that's compensate, and that's kind of what we've been talking about, the offsets market and the ability of offsets to generate compensation for those remaining emissions. And it's that whole last bucket that is, essentially, what we're saying is we need this bucket in the BC climate framework. BC's got the first two buckets. Why don't we have the third bucket? And we need it, particularly with those aspirations that are 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And then we start to dig into that. That again, doesn't have to be exclusive. They can be synergistic. The idea of having offsets and trading that complements something with carbon pricing through carbon tax, they can be very synergistic, and the policies can be designed in a way that work together. We did have Delphi go and do a review of those jurisdictions that had both carbon trading or emissions trading systems.
Why do we do this?
And last year.
That's
And
numbers gone up.
yeah, it's gone up, but I was going to say and offsets. So to have both those things working together, I think they just had 16 that we looked at. Well, 16 we looked at. Okay, there could be more.
Did you see my map earlier?
Yeah, I know, but it's also, yes, fair enough. And it's growing. I guess that was your point. This is growing.
It's almost like a column, right?
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
that it's growing.
It is. So yeah, 1 year ago we did this, and now it's outdated. There's more and more happening out there. And then we did.
Not your trade partners, BC, Canada, trade partners and competitors are doing this. Not just the fixed price. They're doing a pricing program and dealing with these issues, but allowing for the flexibilities to be taken.
Yeah. And I mentioned this. The carbon tax policy of BC has been world leading, but at the end of the day, the measure is 2% difference since 2007. Mind you, there has been significant economic growth, and the GDP number looks very good. Like if you say how much carbon emissions per GDP, we can see that's going down and driving to, I can't remember what the numbers were. They were pretty significant.
I don't have them in front of me either, but
Yeah.
just to point on that though, like,
Yeah.
it is population growth and economic growth at the same time as a 2% reduction, more so than other places in the country. But I don't think it's totally fair to say it's a BC carbon tax policy only. There's other carrots and sticks in there. There's
Yeah,
regulatory
yeah,
things,
yeah.
There's incentives for home retrofits and all kinds of things that have happened, not just the carbon tax.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I would say more the BC policy to date rather than carbon tax, shall we say. And I will amend that before we post.
That makes it sound like that's the only thing we're.
Yeah, no, we've been doing a lot of good stuff. And then the last point here is around carbon offsets and trading can contribute to, it's about maybe timing. They can contribute to reductions, but in a near and medium term, which can then allow you more time for those technological changes, because I can get to net zero without offsets. but you just need to give me 25 years, okay, and to develop the technology, and it's going to be hydrogen reforming at the burner tip. And so every molecule of natural gas that comes to a burner tip gets reformed to hydrogen, burns with 0 CO2. And the carbon is solid, and it goes and it gets landfilled. Okay, so there's my technology. It just needs some time to get there. So we have net zero, basically natural gas. Okay, so there's ways to get there through technology, but we need time. And so that's what this can do, these offsets and trading, particularly around the nature-based solutions, like forestry type things, and agriculture. They're going to get reductions today and buy the time to get the technology in play to get to net zero. And creating room for economic growth. That's the other thing that the offsets and trading do today. It's like we wanted these investments. They are the cleanest gas in the world, or the cleanest aluminum in the world, and we don't want those investments to go away from BC. So how do we cover for the carbon footprint here today? And so that's, again, could be a role for the offsets trading market mechanisms. We did talk a little about the BC government's program, and on the right is a chart that kind of showed that around $700,000 and $800,000 in, sorry, 700 to 800,000 tons, million tons. Sorry, 700 to 800,000 tons, or 0.7 to 0.8 million tons per year of reductions through offset investments covers the government of British Columbia's internal carbon footprint. That's sort of the, and then that program's been going on for quite a number of years. But I guess the point I was coming to here is that we did Blue Source, and Jamie McKinnon was on the phone, or did a study in 2018 for LNG Canada specifically. And then they did an update on that study for the BC LCIS. But based on that study, what they found, they had, based on the protocols that had been put on the books as high potential protocols for BC, if they went forward and started developing those protocols and projects, there was at least 20 million tons per year of CO2 abatement available in BC through these offsets. So maybe their top dozen protocols or something by 2030, because we're still going to need some time to do the work. So
All types.
that was more or less an all types thing, yeah. Some were economic in that they would be below $30, and some were expensive. So then it really hadn't been risked for cost, I shall say. But it just the core numbers, or the raw number on volumes, it's there. There's a material opportunity sitting there. I think that was kind of the big aha out of it all. The forestry or nature-based projects, and Jamie did qualify those as largely the forest management, not reforestation, afforestation type, and conservation was the biggest of those dozen. And I think they had them in that initial study, the 2018 study, at around 11. I've seen numbers between 11 and 13 million tons per year by 2030, just from the forestry component. So it's definitely material. He talked about fuel switching earlier today. That was another opportunity, whether it's in remote communities or in upstream oil and gas, or in anything. Switching to electric drives from gas to power drives was a big one still out there. There is an area of unregulated that still has potential as an offset. And then methane was another biggie. CCS was a biggie in there, like in terms of volumes, but it's one of the longer term things, right? It's longer to get there, and it's costly. But we do see movement in south of the border, and that there, all of a sudden, 1 year ago even, or 2 years ago, it felt like we were leading. Canada's leading in CCS. We have a little hub going up in Alberta. We've got some money from Alberta driving those projects, and we have some other activities across the country. But overnight, they bring that 45Q program, which says we're going to give you actually $50 US a ton to put that stuff in the ground. And there's 10 new projects now going forward in the US on CCS. And
Also, the CCS protocol for the low carbon fuel standard.
yes, and that's another big driver, right? The fact that CCS would be recognized as a mitigation under low carbon fuel standard, yeah, credited. So they're moving on this stuff, and so again, that's policy driving it. But anyways, it was a pretty significant potential in BC too. I think we had anywhere from 1 to 3 million tons of abatement by 20. But again, 2030 might even be a stretch, because I know I developed the Quest project. I didn't develop it, but I was part of that early front end piece, and it just takes a long time. It took more than 10 years. And a lot of government support, and a lot of policy development to
And
go
a lot
with
of
it.
policy
Yeah,
innovation.
yeah. It was everything. It's every tool in the toolbox to get one of those
They
things
still
off the
talk, they
ground.
talk about it frequently on, like, so the circuit globally, which we worked a lot with Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and a bunch of different, actors in the CCS, CCUS space. Quest project is, certainly as a model, and leadership on that front. On very quickly,
lose our audience.
I know, CCS protocol, British Columbia, there was work being done on the CCS protocol, where is it? Was there not work being done on it?
Before my time, a few years ago, I don't know if there's anything recently. Check.
Oh, wow.
They have started to make the legislative policy changes required to be able to do it, physically do it. I haven't seen it get completed.
Okay, interesting.
I just want to make actually a point that we didn't talk much about today, and it's multiplier effect. So I heard the point made that every dollar going to an offset is a dollar that's taken out of the government's pocket, because it's carbon tax revenue, not going as revenue, but going now into an offset developer's pocket. But I would argue that they did do Eco Resources did a review of the BC government program to understand what the economic impact was of the offset projects they did. And so there's clearly a multiplier. So it was like $53 million going into offset projects. However, those projects attracted $327 million more of private investment to make it go. And then those projects delivered jobs and economic revenue for the province, and rent back to the governments in terms of taxes. So the money does go around, and it comes back to them through revenues from those economic activities. But more importantly, this was just a small sampling, right, where we had 53 million in offset projects over those 6 years, and only 4.5 million tons of offsets in 6 years, delivering 2,900 jobs. So now if you say, okay, to Alex's scenario, well, 7 million tons we need per year, it's doing that every year, times more than, 1.5. That can deliver a lot of jobs, and it can deliver a lot of capital investment. And
I'll just say the ERA numbers for Alberta, that ratio, 6 to 1.
yeah, is it similar?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's attracting that capital.
The leverage.
Yeah.
The leverage.
So if it was 7 million tons of offsets per year times whatever they were worth, $30, call it, what's that, 2 billion? And then the multiplier means it attracts times 7. It's attracting more than $10 billion in investment. So the numbers go quickly up. So I would just argue that it's not a dollar lost and a dollar gain for it's really there is the cycle, there is the economic engine. Yeah.
We're gonna repeat that tomorrow.
Yeah, and we've got a report on that. And I think since we're running out of time, I think there was we identified in this work around the nature-based piece and the importance of nature-based, and the importance actually of including communities in the development of those nature bays. So that was really the aha as well. And then also, it just talked about the potential. This is a huge business potential. And one of the other things we talked about was ITMOs. And I'm a little cool on ITMOs just because I want to see the money stay here. And for every ITMO that you would want to have come back here, we could do all this work to try and bring an ITMO back home. But guess what? We have to pay for it. We still got to pay the money to have it. It's like, yeah, I'll get it back, and what are you giving me in exchange? Oh, I give you $30 a ton or whatever. That means the money went out. It went out the door to another country. And why are we keeping that money here and developing those reductions here? So that's kind of why I'm a little cool on ITMOs, but because the potential's here. And then basically we had one of our key recommendations was that the BC government should establish a work stream, but I also recognize to look at timing and process and the potential for market mechanisms within the Clean BC program. So, and then we had also earmarked nature-based as a key priority area that they needed to be looking at protocols, which they're doing a lot of this stuff, but these were the recommendations that came at the end of last year in the fall. ITMOs, we did also say, continue to study this. It is an important piece, but of course there's Rob Seeley's take on it, which is keep your money at home if you can. And that's kind of it. I did talk a little, I don't think we want to, we'll save these policy tool discussion for tomorrow because we're out of time today.